Anyways, Zarinah is going to give us our lecture tonight. It's really cool. She's been coordinating these events for a long time. 2 events a week, which is a tremendous burden, but I think a huge asset to our community in spreading discourses about various topics around San Francisco, which I think is a really important thing that she's been doing. In addition to this, she has a full-time job as a neuroscientist, and I think she's going to be talking on that research tonight in her lecture, Monkey See, Monkey Do, Debunking Neurons. So without further ado, Zarinah.
Big turnout here. This is really awesome. It's nice to see lots of new faces. So, you'd be interested to know that I gave this exact same talk as a 5-minute picture of Burning Man and a 15-minute talk at the Exploratorium last week, and today it's going to be a bit longer. So I think I'm going to talk for about 45 minutes around on this topic, and then hopefully maybe do a question and answer or a discussion at the end.
Before you start, can we turn off the music that's coming out of this speaker?
What? Is it? What?
Oh, it's a Bluetooth. It's what?
What?
It should be a Bluetooth. Can you not just turn it off?
Yeah, okay, someone's going to come and have a look. Okay, sorry about that. I'm a neuroscientist. I work at UCSF, just up the hill. I work on motor control. I did my PhD in mirror neurons. It's a treacherous place to do research. So I haven't really talked about it for a long time, but I feel like I'm over the scars now. So, the first thing I'm going to show you is a little video. This is a 3-week-old rhesus macaque monkey and an Italian scientist wearing safety goggles for some reason. So here, this scientist is very seriously trying to get the attention of this 3-week-old animal with some success.
I guess he's scared of it.
I think he's a bit amused.
No, I mean, he must be scared of wearing a goggles.
You should be scared of getting the herpes virus that can kill him if that monkey spits on him.
Yeah, these are lab animals, so it's unlikely. So here you can see the researcher is opening his mouth, and very quickly, as soon as this is a 3-week-old animal, so it's very young, as soon as it fixes its gaze on the human, it's able to identify the action that's happening, and then it starts to imitate. So this is pretty impressive, because until recently people thought that non-human primates didn't really imitate. And I'm just going to show you another quick video just to show you that this isn't just a laboratory setting. In the wild, this also seems to happen. And there's a number of examples of how non-human primates do imitate in the wild. So this is just to say that action perception, so observing action, and production of action are really important things. In fact, so any of you who heard my Exploratorium talk will know that I refer to myself as a motor chauvinist, which is a way of describing the fact that most of what the human brain is for controlling movement and perception of movement. In fact, if you can't move, you can't impact the world in any way apart from crying or sweating on it. If you can't move, you can't speak, you can't touch things, you can't interact with your other species. And so movement is really an important part of what we do. And with that, perception of movement is also really important. So I'm just going to quickly touch on what motor is, because it's a bit of a confusing concept for lots of people. So there's a whole part of the brain that's dedicated to movement of the body. And there's a strip called primary motor cortex, which is in the frontal lobe that has neurons, which operate different parts of the body. And you can see here this strip, and you can see that different parts of the body are represented along the strip. Okay, so this is really important because this is where mirror neurons have been found in motor cortex. So this is a nice little brain. So if I was to try and perform an action, some information would come into my eyes and reach my occipital lobe at the back of my brain. Information then is passed forward into the parietal lobes, and then the parietal lobes talk to the frontal lobes, which is motor cortex, and actually they talk in this reciprocal manner, so parietal and frontal regions talk in both directions in 2 slightly separate ways. So there are these medial and lateral reciprocal loops that are there for different kinds of grasping actions. And then we have this part at the front, which is prefrontal cortex, which many of you will know is really important for kind of deciding when to move, deciding when to do that inappropriate movement, deciding when not to do that inappropriate movement, that kind of thing. And once motor cortex has decided that it's going to go for it and make the inappropriate movement, the information is sent down through the brainstem into the spinal cord, and then once it leaves the brain and enters the spinal cord, it crosses over to the other side of the body. So the left side of your motor cortex controls the right side of your body. Okay, so that's our introduction to the motor system. So you can see here that these more medial loops are for reaching and the more lateral groups are for grasping. So, mirror neurons. Mirror neurons have had some good press over the last 20 years. They've excited a lot of people. Interestingly enough, like a lot of interesting scientific advances, they were discovered by accident. In this situation, this was in 1992 in Italy, these scientists were recording from dorsal premotor cortex. And this part of the brain traditionally has motor neurons in it. So they had electrodes deep in the cortical surface of these animals, and when the monkey performs an action, in this experiment it was picking up a peanut, the cell starts to fire. And then one day, as they were walking in front of the animal to fix the apparatus, they realized that the same cell was firing when the human walked in front of the monkey and picked up the peanut. And that's how they were discovered. So, this is the little cartoon. So here you can see the monkey is picking up a peanut, and these are the firing of the cells. And you see the same cells fire when the monkey stays completely still but observes the human picking up the peanut. And these cells have now been found in a few different areas. So this is a macaque brain. It looks a bit different to a human brain. It's less foldy and a little smaller. They've been found in 3 areas now. So I'm going to try not to use any horrible anatomical jargon because it's a conversation killer. F5 in the premotor cortex, PF, which lies in ventral parietal lobe, and M1, which is primary motor cortex. These are the 3 regions in the macaque brain where mirror neurons have been found. And it's really important that we remember these are all motor regions. So you can imagine, it's not very exciting, for example, if we see activation when you perform an action and you perceive an action in your visual cortex, right? That kind of makes sense because you're observing the action. That's not a mirror neuron, that has to be in motor cortex. So what's really interesting about macaque mirror neurons, what got people really excited about them is they seem to be doing some really high-level things. So here we have, so we've already identified that these cells are responding when the animal picks up a peanut or picks up an object. And here we see the traditional response, which is when they see a human hand reaching out to pick up an object, the cell is also firing. But interestingly, if the human hand just mimes picking up an object and the object isn't there, the cell doesn't fire. So it needs to be an interaction between a hand and an object. More interestingly, so this is a bit complicated, so what they do in this experiment is they put an object on the table in front of the monkey, and then they put a screen in front of it so it can no longer see the object, and then the hand goes to reach for the object behind the screen. Now the mirror neuron fires. Now when they don't put the object on the table, and they just put the screen, and the monkey knows that there's no object behind the screen, the cell does not fire. So these cells are able to infer the goal of an action, which is pretty high level. And interestingly, they fire very early on, so it seems like they're doing something very quick and pretty high level. On top of that, they are some of these cells are extremely specific, so they will only fire when the monkey does a very specific action and when it sees that exact same action. So here you can see this poor animal has been trained to grasp a peanut in a human's hand and twist it back and forth. And a very boring experiment. You can see that the cell's only firing when the hand rotates in one direction and not in the other. So it's extremely specific to a very directional action. And the same is true for perception here. And on the right you see it's not firing at all for a different kind of grasping motion. So some mirror neurons are extremely highly specific at matching the action that the monkey does and the action that it observes. And others are really broadly congruent in that they will respond to a specific performance of an action, but then they will respond to the perception of lots of different actions. So take-home message number 1, Mirror neurons are not a single class of cells. There's a lot of different kinds of mirror neurons. There are, I haven't even got into it all today, but they're highly congruent and broadly congruent. There are visual motor, there are also auditory motor mirror neurons. These are cells that respond when a monkey chews a peanut, but also when it hears the sound of the peanut being chewed. There are mirror-like neurons, which respond to seeing an object and performing the same action. So there's a whole range of different cells which fall into this class of mirror neurons. So mirror neurons were really came into their own because they were really the first kind of neuroscience evidence for what's known as simulation theory, which is a sort of sub-part of embodied cognition. And the idea is that that all kinds of actions that we perceive may be encoded in how we do them. So things like covert actions, imagined actions, remembered actions, predicted actions, all of these sort of internal processes that don't actually result in movement are actually neurologically encoded in the same kinds of structures that are used to produce those actions. So that's the theory behind simulation theory. And these are all of the things that people have suggested mirror neurons do. So there's a huge range of stuff here. People have suggested that they're behind action recognition, imitation of action, tool use, the acquisition of speech, understanding actions, empathy, and that if your mirror neurons go wrong, somehow you end up with schizophrenia or autism, all these crazy things. But what do mirror neurons really do? We don't really have any idea what macaque mirror neurons do. We have zero evidence as to what they do in the macaque brain, unfortunately. So the ideal experiment, in fact the only experiment that we would want to do if we were to find out what they do in the macaque, is to identify these cells and then transiently turn them off, which is something we can do, and then see what the animal can't do. That would be the experiment that would tell us what these cells do. This was done once in 1996, once these cells were turned off, the animal was no longer able to move, but they didn't do the crucial test, which is can the animal still perceive other actions or imitate that kind of thing. So we don't have any idea what they do in the perceptual domain, which is unfortunate. Take home number 3. The equivalent of the macaque mirror neuron has never been found in the human brain. This is tricky because we all want to believe that they exist, right? And you certainly would not know this from what you see, not even in the media. This is a very prominent neuroscientist at UCSD. This is his TED Talk. It's got nearly 2 million views, and this guy claimed that mirror neurons are the cell that shaped human civilization. He also claimed that mirror neurons were going to do for psychology what DNA did for genetics. And so he had these like really wild claims about how important these cells are. And unfortunately there's just no grounding for that. That's not to say it's not true, it may be true, we just don't know. Right now it's really a lot of speculation. So, are there such things as human mirror neurons? So there's been a lot of studies. If you look up in scientific databases, macaque mirror neuron studies, there's probably like maybe 50. If you look up humans, there's like thousands and thousands. And the closest we've ever come to looking at actual human mirror neurons is this study. This was done a few years ago. So this was looking in a lot of patients who were undergoing surgery for epilepsy. And they put deep brain electrodes into a number of sites. So over all of their subjects, they recorded from over 1,000 sites. So they got a lot of information. I don't know if you can see it here, but all of these dots are the sites that they recorded from. Now, these experiments are invaluable for neuroscience, but we are completely restricted to what part of the brain is exposed during surgery. So you can't record from everywhere you want. And unfortunately, only 5 of these electrodes of these 1,000 were in motor cortex. And so we can only really speak to those 5. And actually, even those 5 were in a different part of the brain. So I'm going to show you my horrible, cheap budget brain I've got here. So if we were looking in humans, we'd be looking down here. And they found them up here, right in the crack. This sort of yellow blob here is where we should be looking, and they found them up here. And then they found them in 3 electrodes out of over 1,000 sites. So, you know, is this mirror neurons or not? It seems possible, but that's not really how science works. You know, We need more data than that. So are there such things as human mirror neurons? I'd say it's very much unclear. So let's forget about mirror neurons for a minute and think about mirror systems. So most of the data you see in the news, in the media, they're really, they won't say this, but actually what they're referring to is a mirror system. So this is some kind of overlap between what's happening. So actually what they mean is when you see activity in motor cortex when you're just perceiving action. And that's an interesting thing, but it may well not be mirror neurons. So this is a study of mine from a few years ago where we got people into an MRI scanner and we got them to produce certain actions, so they'd have to reach out and grab a pen, and then I'd scuttle in, and pick up a pen in front of them, scuttle out again. And we looked at which parts of the brain were active in both of these conditions. This is not a very glamorous life being a scientist. And we looked at which parts of the brain were active in both those conditions, and actually what you see is these really perfectly bilateral frontal parietal activations, which is exactly what you see in cats. So it is, interestingly, the same areas. However, it's really hard to say whether you're looking at activity in the same neuron or whether these are just neurons that sort of like inhabit the same part of the brain. So in all of these images you see with blobs on them, you're actually looking at hundreds of thousands of neuronal firings. You can't look at single cells. And then, so I then went on to spend the rest of my PhD trying to characterize how this kind of overlap system responded to different kinds of actions. And just to show you that these are 4 different kinds of actions. So picking up an object, performing a sort of non-object directed action, which was something like this, or a finger tap, and you can see that the overlap between perception and production is vastly different for different kinds of actions, which is basically telling you that if we do have mirror responses, they're not across the board the same for different kinds of actions. So there's something going on there, something about the complexity and the novelty of the action elicits these much stronger overlaps. So that's fMRI data. Sorry, I should have said that. That's fMRI data. So I'm going to talk a bit about some interesting stuff that's been done with transcranial magnetic stimulation. So this is a really interesting technique where we can put a rapidly alternating magnetic field just outside of your head. A couple of people in here have had this done. And using this magic wand, as I call it, we can stimulate the cortical surface. So here you can see what the magnet looks like, and we can get to the pyramidal cells in the cortex up to about 3 centimeters down, which is pretty good. And we can stimulate that part of your motor cortex that moves, that gives you a twitch in your body. And what this does is we can then record from that muscle, and the size of the response in the muscle tells us how excited your spinal cord is. It tells us about corticospinal excitability. And this is a measure of what your brain is doing. And what's interesting is if you do this while people are observing an action, not when they're performing, but just observing, you see the same kind of response in motor cortex when they're observing an action as to when they're executing an action, which tells us that motor cortex is active when you're just simply observing something. And what's really interesting is that this is 2 studies, I haven't seen it replicated since then, so but what's really interesting is these both found that when you observe an action, the pattern of any muscle activation follows the exact spatial and temporal pattern of the action you're observing. Does that make sense? So if I was to produce this movement, this muscle's moved first, then this muscle, then this muscle, this muscle. And when you do the same thing for observing that, the spatial and temporal pattern of the muscle excitability mirrors the movement that you're seeing. So that's pretty interesting and compelling evidence that something in motor cortex is simulating what you're seeing. So this is another study that I thought was pretty cool. So the idea is to ask the question, is just observing an action enough to influence the production of a subsequent action? So in this experiment, again, they applied a single pulse of TMS to motor cortex, and this elicits movement in the hand. So basically what happens is we stimulate here, and your hand goes boink, like this. The direction of your thumb twitch is random. So sometimes your thumb will go this way, sometimes it will go this way. And then they said, well, after we get people to train moving their thumb in one direction, maybe we can push the chance of their thumb moving in that direction So then they basically have people go practice doing this, right? And then they stimulate the brain, and sure enough, they're more likely to move their thumb to the right if they've been physically practicing going to the right than to the left. And they also found that simply observing somebody else twitching their thumb to the right was enough to push this bias of thumb direction movement in the same way. So that's pretty compelling. It's also telling us that simply observing an action is enough to influence the motor representations of your up-and-coming actions. So I'm going to talk to you about EEG. This is another glamorous neuroscience technique. You should definitely all come and do my experiments and get to try on this really snazzy stuff. So this is a 64-channel EEG head cap. So this measures electrical signals going across the scalp. And we can measure a lot of different stuff. So these are the different kinds of frequency bands that we tend to pick up. I'm not going to focus on them too much right now. I'm going to just focus on this alpha wave. So the alpha wave, so in motor cortex produces a mu wave, which is a type of alpha wave, and we pick it up somewhere around here. And basically what happens in motor cortex, when you're not doing anything, when you're completely still, and this is true across the brain, your neurons will start to fire in an oscillatory way, and you see these big sort of waves like this. And that's because they're not really doing anything coordinated. And then as you start to move, the pattern of firing becomes really specific and coordinated, and you see a loss in this power in this specific frequency band. So you'll see a reduction in your alpha waves when you move, because suddenly your brain is doing coordinated activity instead of this kind of like oscillating pattern. So we know that the suppression of your mu waves is what happens when you move your body. The suppression of your mu waves is also what happens when you observe somebody else moving their body. So again, there's evidence in all directions that motor cortex is doing something similar when you're perceiving compared to production. And it's this evidence that led good old Ramachandran, the same guy, to his broken mirrors hypothesis. So this was the idea that, so there is some evidence that in people with autism, that the suppression of their mu waves when they're perceiving action is slightly different. It's definitely not clear, but anyway, he's come up with this idea of the broken mirrors hypothesis with this very upsetting looking image to go with it. Anyway, so all of that is a long way of saying that human motor cortices, like forget about mirror neurons for a second, human motor cortices are doing something when you're not moving and you're simply observing action, which is very interesting. This may or may not be the result of mirror neurons. It's really hard to say. We certainly can't say that right now. But even if it were true that this activity was the result of human mirror neurons, we still have no idea what the human mirror system is doing either. So even if you said, right, all of these activations we see in motor cortex, it's definitely the result of mirror neurons, it doesn't really help us because we still haven't got any idea really what these activations that we're seeing in motor cortex are doing. So interesting things are happening in motor cortices. So did I mention this? Yeah, so motor cortices are active when you see or hear action. And what's interesting is that if you make the perception of whatever action it is harder, so if it's sound, you can degrade it by putting noise. If it's vision, you can just make the test hard. And if you make identifying the action harder, what you see is you see more activity in motor cortices. So, it's my kind of opinion that perhaps what you're seeing is that we have sensory cortices dedicated to perceiving action, but when life is hard, when there's a lot of noise in the background, when perception is difficult, we recruit motor cortices to kind of help boost our sensory systems. And there's a good deal of evidence this might be the case. We've already seen that observing action is enough to influence up-and-coming action, which is very compelling. So there is some evidence that patients with brain damage in these regions have perceptual problems also. So this is the crucial experiment. Remember how I said that the crucial experiment in monkeys would be to take out mirror neurons and then see what the monkey can't do. This is what we tend to do in our lesion studies with patients. So we look for patients who have very focal lesions in these regions, and we see what they can't do. So if you look in patients with apraxia who've lost, following a stroke usually, they've lost these parts of the brain, sort of here-ish, which is where mirror neurons reside, the question is, do these people have problems in perceiving action? Because if they did, that would tell us that perhaps these motor neurons have a role in perception. And if you look hard, they do. I mean, it's definitely not clear. it's not the case that if you've lost these parts of the brain you can't perceive action, but if you make the test quite hard and you look very subtly for what's going on, you can pick up slight deficits in the ability to categorize actions. So you can say, like, what do? They get a loaf of bread and they cut the loaf of bread with a toothbrush and they say to these patients, "Is this right?" You know, that kind of thing. And you can pick up subtle deficits in these patients, but it's not the case that they're all going around chopping up loads of breads with toothbrushes. And then there are some really interesting things, like so they did a study recently where they got people to observe different species doing different kinds of actions. So they had people observing dogs barking and eating, and monkeys eating, and monkeys doing monkey woofs, I don't know what that is. And they found that human motor cortices are active when you see a dog eating, and you see a monkey eating, but not when you see a dog barking. And the idea here was that if you are observing an action that you don't do yourself, you haven't got a motor representation for yourself, that perhaps you're not activating the motor cortices in the same way as you would if it was an action. So there's some pretty cool stuff going on in motor cortices. So why do we see this? It's been 20 years. So Neurons was discovered in 92. So it's been a really long time. And these theories persist in the media. They just will not go away. It was very difficult to get published in the field because there's such a strong tendency to suggest that these cells are the sort of core basis of perception of action. And it's been kind of dogmatic and hard. And I think if we think about why that is, I think the answer is that it's just a very compelling idea. So production of action is a computationally hard thing, and perception of action is also very hard. And the idea of trying to figure out how the brain fucking matches these two things is like abominably hard. And it's really easy to be like, oh well, it's just a single cell and it just does it for us. You know, it's a really nice, way of explaining something that we don't understand, basically. And you see this happen in neuroscience a lot. We'll discover a cell that seems to do something fancy, like the grandmother cell, the Jennifer Aniston cell. Everybody gets really excited, and we're like, oh, we found a cell that encodes Jennifer Aniston, and then everyone realizes that's not really how it works, and then they go back to the depressed laboratories. So, I'm going to stop being so negative and talk about some other things. So, you know, like, if we forget about neurons, we forget about motor cortex, and we think about other kinds of mirroring that you see in the brain, there's some really cool stuff going on. So I wanted to touch on the idea of mirror touch synesthesia, which is really fascinating. So this is a condition, I think, sort of occurs in like 1 to 2 people out of every 100. And it's something that happens in all of us, but in these people it's extremely strong. So what happens here is that when people observe someone being touched, they feel the same sensation. And it's pretty strong, so people will report if you hold a glass full of ice in front of them, they will report feeling actual cold fingers, or if you touch your face, they will feel a sensation in their cheek. And of course it's most strong in pain, so pain is extremely difficult for these people. And what's interesting is that most people with mirror touch synesthesia will show a mirror response in that I see your left cheek being touched and I will feel it in my right cheek. So it's not anatomical, it's mirrored. And then a very small population of people will anatomically represent the feeling. So that's interesting. It's also interesting because the intensity of feeling is often modulated by how similar the person is to you. So if they're the same race or the same gender, or they look like you, the sensations are stronger. So it seems that there's a real link between the tactile sensation and the sense of self that's present in these people. And as for where this seems to be present in the brain, there are some sort of pretty fundamental changes associated with the brain structures involved, which is also interesting. So there is some pretty solid research around other kinds of mirroring that happens in the brain outside the motor cortex. And I think, you know, it's something that we should think about without having to worry about what the mirror neurons are behind it. But if you see this research, you cannot read it without people going on about mirror neurons. So the other thing I wanted to show you is this data from, again, from the 90s. So this is a recording from anterior cingulate, so completely not motor cortex, completely it's like right in the wedge down here, like not a motor part of the brain. So these are single cells that are responding to experiencing pain in the anterior cingulate, and also when the patient watches somebody else experience pain. So there are all sorts of kind of mirroring systems going on outside of motor cortex. So this is a really interesting experiment. It's kind of hard to describe, and this is a terrible figure, but I'm going to tell you about it anyway because it's kind of mental. So this is two patients who have a very rare condition. They have haptic deafferentation. So that's the loss of all cutaneous, all touch and proprioceptive sensation. One from the nose down and one from the chin down. And what they did is they got these people to watch videos of actors picking things up. So let me see if I can describe this properly. So the people in the videos were picking up one of two things. They were either picking up a small box or a big box. And the box could either be small and heavy, or small and light, or big and heavy and big and light. And in some of the videos, the actor was told whether the thing they were going to pick up was heavy or not. Right? So you've got the actor, sometimes they're aware that they're about to pick up something really heavy, and so they're sort of preparing for it. And in some, they have no idea whether the thing they're going to pick up is heavy or light. And these two patients had a selective deficit in the ability to tell whether the actor knew how heavy the thing they were going to pick up was. Does that make sense? So somehow, because they had lost their proprioceptive and touch sensation, they were unable to tell, to kind of internally simulate from the movements of this actor whether or not this person had information about what they were about to do. Which really does kind of point to this idea that on some level, in uncertain circumstances, we are sort of internally simulating what we see. So that's pretty fascinating. So at the end of it all, I feel like I've droned on about enough stuff now. I just want to finish off by saying that macaque neurons do exist. They're really fascinating, and I'm not dissing them. I think they're fascinating things. There's a lot of research that we still need to do around them. In humans, we have to talk about mirror systems. We can't really speak to mirror neurons because, as I said, we've not found them. But mirror systems are still very interesting. Outside of motor cortex, there are other things going on which are really fascinating. Again, we can't refer to them as mirror neurons, and I really implore all of you, when you go ahead and you go to dinner parties and you talk about these things, don't talk about mirror neurons. It's a different thing. And traditional theories of motor simulation are really far too simplistic. That's not to say that motor cortices aren't doing something interesting, but the way that they're discussed right now are far too simplistic. And like I said before, it's my personal opinion that motor cortices are doing something supportive, and that what happens in patients when they have lost parts of the brain that are involved in perception, motor cortices really step in to help. For the rest of us, when there's like background noise, when we're trying to speak to each other and there's background noise, or our perception is impaired in that way, that's when motor cortices really seem to step in and play a role. And that's it. Yeah, does anyone have any questions? Yeah, oh yeah.
So you said that perception can lead to activation in the motor cortex. Is that also true of just thinking about an action? So if like a cellist thinks about practicing, or if a baseball player thinks about throwing, does that motor cortex also get active? And if so, then what does that mean?
Okay, so the question was, when you think about action, you imagine, for example, playing an instrument or playing a sport, do you also see activity in motor cortex? And yeah, you do. So if I was to imagine myself speaking, I would be activating my motor cortex. If I was to imagine myself playing an instrument also, you also see stuff happening in sensory cortex. So if I imagine myself singing, I would see activity in auditory cortex. So your brain is really like simulating the whole process. Not just the motor side of it, but certainly it's strong enough that it's a really valid technique for athletes. You know, they practice by imagery, and there's some really fascinating data from the 50s in France showing that if you watch people running across a screen, you burn more calories than if you see lots of moving dots. Yes is the answer. Yeah.
So then, if we have that ability to mirror the world internally, then what does it matter if it's mirror neurons or mirror system? Doesn't that seem like
irrelevant?
amazing?
Oh yeah, that's my point. Yeah, my point is that there is some internal simulation going on. So what's unclear is the role of that simulation. So if you lose your motor cortices, it's not like you suddenly can't remember running. That doesn't seem to be the case. It's not like you can't perceive somebody else running. And that's the kind of argument that's being made now, that you need to have motor cortices in order to perceive or imagine any kind of movement. So all I'm saying is that we do seem to simulate perceived action. It's not clear why, and it's certainly not clear that it's mirror neurons. But it's definitely happening. Yeah. Sorry, I can't. Go for it.
Okay. On an early slide, you mentioned a theory, I think called simulation theory.
Mm-hmm.
Could you go into some detail about what simulation theory is?
Mm-hmm. So it's this idea that we internally represent so if I see you picking up a cup, so the idea is that it's rather than my visual cortex being like, oh, I see a hand moving, it's moving towards a mouth, and it's going to put liquid in there. The idea is that actually what happens is the information is very quickly represented in motor cortices, and that I actually almost kind of internally simulate what you're doing, and through internally simulating it, I'm like, oh, I see, he's drinking water. So the idea is that your motor cortices represent perceived action as opposed to your perceptual cortices.
Right.
Does that make sense?
Yes.
Yeah. And the same goes for speech. So it extends to speech. So rather than like, I hear your words and I interpret them using my auditory cortex and my semantic networks, the idea is I hear them and then I internally simulate them, and then that's how I understand what you're saying. So I think it's a slightly mad theory. Yeah. Yeah.
What's the relationship between mirror systems and emotions like empathy and how we process facial expression?
Right. So interestingly enough, the mirror touch synesthesia, I don't call them patients because they're not patients, it's a phenomenon rather than not disorder. They are much faster at recognizing facial expressions. And interestingly enough, they're not better at recognizing faces, but they're faster at recognizing facial expressions and more accurate. So definitely in that instance, it seems that having this ramped up ability to feel the tactile sensations of other people does feed into the emotional recognition also. It's not clear in motor cortices that that's the case. There's a lot of people who would say that, but it's not quite clear.
Can you illuminate why a connection between autism and mirror systems has been drawn?
Yeah, so before I finish that, I should say there is some evidence, I don't know if I want to say this, but I'm going to say it anyway. There is some evidence that when you have Botox, so Botox is like a sort of toxin that people inject into their muscles to prevent their muscles from moving so much and so forth, makes you look younger apparently. Anyway, the point is that it stops your face from moving so much. And there is some evidence that in these people, once they've had a lot of Botox, they become less good at perceiving facial expressions. Yeah, watch it, guys. And so, hang on, so the second part of the question was? Autism. Yeah, so this comes from the New Wave data. So you can, if you look at motor cortices of people who have autism, when they're perceiving action, their New Waves are abnormal. Their suppression is less when they're perceiving action. It's not really clear. I've seen a lot of evidence in both directions. So the idea of this broken mirrors hypothesis, I think, is really a ropey one. Yeah. Oh, hang on, Alex, sorry, and then you, Alex.
Okay. Right. You mentioned that people who observe or perceive action through difficulty, through a degraded lens, that activates the motor cortex further.
Mhm.
Does that have any effect on memory of the thing they have perceived, or is that nothing to study?
So is the question, if it's harder to perceive the action, does it affect the memory of it?
Yes, either positively or negatively.
I don't really know. I don't work on memory at all. Yeah, I'm not sure. I think, generally speaking, if something's harder to perceive, if you succeed at perceiving it despite the hardness, it's encoded better. Right? Like if you go to great lengths to like write something down once you've remembered it, you really encode it hard. It's usually easier to recall. So I think the sort of like difficulty associated with the task can often lead to it being encoded in a sort of like more long-term manner. But I don't think that just the presence of noise in the signal would make it affect the memory in a general way. Sorry.
So, is there any significant research in mirror neurons or mirror systems in animals outside of macaques? Like, what was it that made them special? Is that just what we chose to study, or was there actually something special about them?
Yeah. So the question was, have we looked outside of macaques and why macaques? So no, we haven't really looked outside of macaques. People have looked at songbirds with some success at producing song and listening to song. But birds, motor cortex in birds is very different. So why macaques? Well, it was an accident, wasn't it? And it's probably just a function of the fact that we do most of our motor research in macaques. So I think if we went and looked in other animals, we would probably find that, at least in other non-human primates, I think we'd find them, yeah. Sorry, there was somebody who missed them, yeah.
Two questions, really. Emotional modulation, the mirror system?
Emotional modulation?
Yeah, I mean, has any work been done on that? And I'm thinking about how the actual motor system of the body is disconnected from the motor system of the brain when we dream. So we're not always moving, we can move a bit when we dream. But I'm wondering, how reciprocal are, say, the nerves going down the spinal cord in this mirroring system? Is there any signals that are bouncing into the somatic body?
Yeah, it's going in both directions. Because remember, so your motor neurons are going out of your body.
During perception, I'm sorry, during perception.
So during perception, is anything going out? Yes. Yeah. So inherently during perception, information is going in because it's an afferent system. So information is coming from the peripheral environment in. So what's interesting is that information is actually going out at the same time, right? So we can record from your peripheral nervous system, from muscles, and record excitement in your peripheral nervous system when you're just perceiving. So
when you're perceiving visually, you can have motor.
Yeah.
Yes. Okay.
Yeah. And auditorily also. So when you hear sounds, we can also record from your peripheral nervous system, from the muscles, and so what's crucial here is that in a perceptual condition, you're seeing afferent and efferent. When people presumed beforehand that if you're passive and you're not moving and you're sitting still, it's just afferent information, it's just incoming and there's nothing going out. Yeah. Sorry, there's a couple of questions on the side. Yes, you.
I was just wondering if they know what genes are actually in the macaques, like which ones are actually responsible for running the mirror neurons, and if they've looked for those in people, and if they can actually figure out which genes are being expressed, and see if they're actually expressed in some part of the brain of people. To figure out in humans if those are actually being expressed to just get over this, get over the whole do we have it or not.
Yeah. So it's not clear that neurons are present at birth. We don't know whether they're born with them or they develop over time. There is a theory of which I understand that they may just be a complete epiphenomenon. It may just be that you tend to perform actions and see actions at the same time, and neurons that fire together wire together, and maybe they're not doing anything, and so maybe it could be just a sort of learned neural response that happens over very long periods of time in extremely social environments. So people have looked at V-wave suppression in young children, but it's really hard. It's really hard to look at them. Anyway, the short answer to your question is no. Nobody's looked at the genetics of it. Back in the corner. Hey.
So, I was wondering, are you aware of any practical implementation of this theory in any field? So, for example, might be a silly example. If I look at a professional baseball player like swinging a bat, will have more chances to become a good baseball player, something like that? Or like any other field that actually uses this theory for whatever real life application?
Yeah, okay, so the strongest application right now is for rehabilitation of patients with brain damage. So now perception of action is used to boost rehabilitative strategies. And it's certainly used in training for musicians and athletes also. Outside of that, I don't know if there are really any applications. So the other thing I should say is that sometimes I've seen, I don't know if I've seen this published, but I've seen people give talks where they've used the neural signals from perception, from motor regions to control robotic arms. So people who can no longer move, they can put electrodes into the motor cortex, you say, imagine moving, and then they can control a robot with limited success. But actually what was really fascinating in this talk, it was here at UCSF actually, was that observing somebody else, in this case it was picking up a cup, was a much better signal for this electrode to control the robotic arm than imagining. So imagining was quite hard, but when you watch somebody else do it, the signals were very good at controlling this robotic arm. So yeah, go on.
Follow up. You just mentioned like athletes using this. Do you have any examples like how they use it, or any training techniques, or?
Yeah, no. I mean, people do it, right? I mean, most of these things, including pharmaceuticals, most of these things we use them, we don't know how they work, right? We know that they work, and so we use them. But I don't know if there's any practical applications that are sort of theoretically driven by this research, because it's just not there yet, unfortunately. Yeah.
So going back to what we're talking about internalizing the way, when we see people making motor action, when we internalize that, I'm wondering if that is something that gets more pronounced over time, and then conversely, if you have gone long stretches of not watching any actions, like for an isolation or something like that, does that get weakened over time?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know. Yeah, it would be really interesting to think about. So the closest we've gotten to that, I guess, is looking in, looking at people who have lost their vision, for example, and you get them to imagine and things like that. So they've really had no visual input to kind of match to the action. But it's kind of inconclusive. But yeah, there have been a couple of studies looking at people who've recently lost the ability to hear or see, and looking at their motor cortex. And it seems that the activations are still there, but different. But I think it's hard to say at this point. Yeah.
On the subject of your personal favorite opinion about the use of the motor mirror system when perception is degraded, what happens when a blind person is learning to navigate an environment with a stick using acoustic cues and that whole is there do you think that's chronically engaging the motor cortex as this kind of extra, I don't know, modeling or simulation module for after a chronic lasting sensory deficit?
So let's remember that the motor cortex is only really active when you hear biological actions, right? So you need to have a motor representation for the action. So that's not always true. That's definitely not always true. It's a bit of oversimplification, but just hearing clicks and things like that are not likely to sort of engage the motor system in the same way. So yeah, certainly if you're learning a new thing where you've got enhanced attention and the task itself is difficult, most of your brain is going to be kind of ramped up and trying much harder. But I don't know that in that example I would say that the mirror system is particularly involved because it seems to be a matching system between perception of action, of biological action, rather than sort of moving the stick around and learning, learning non-biological action.
Well, you can also have it where you have a big loss of central vision and you have to make sense of a blurry picture by looking off to the side with your peripheral vision. Then you have to deal with a degraded image. Or if you just leave your glasses at home or something.
Absolutely, yeah. So what I'm saying is that we're here talking about biological action, right? So biological sounds, that is sounds that are made by other human beings, and movements of other human beings' body parts. Those are the things we're referring to. Outside of that is a different thing. There is a motor theory of attention also. There's a whole other world of pain. So these people would say that all stimuli engage the motor system. Yeah.
One question on the mirror touch synesthesia. Like a simple one was you mentioned something about reporting feeling cold when another action happened, and that's all report based and not measurement based. That those studies are based. And then the other question was a little bit about the reduction of the intensity of the feeling when you don't feel as if a person is like you. And I was wondering if there was any spectrum of analysis on empathy amongst people who were, say, open-minded, one-planning people, or people with slightly more insular, xenophobic.
Right.
Can you detect racists with this?
Yeah. I mean, you can detect racists with a lot of things, right? You can detect racism. It's not hard, right? You just have to go and look at your OkCupid data or whatever.
Breakdown of identifying with other people.
Yeah. So hang on. The first question was the intensity of. Was it something about the intensity of stimulation and empathy? Is that right?
So I think the first question was it measured by reporting or by measuring?
Yeah, so it is measured by reporting, but we've done neuroimaging on these people also. So what happens is you see increased activation in somatosensory cortex, which is the part of the cortex that is responsible for tactile sensation. You see it in primary and secondary somatosensory cortex, these larger activations where you're simply observing somebody else being touched. And actually what you see is in secondary somatosensory cortex, which is sort of here somewhere, that's not a very good demonstration of where it is, there is increased grey matter. So structural changes associated with this phenomenon also, but yes, it is self-reported, yeah. But oftentimes in synesthesia, I think we have a hard time believing that it's real, but people heard about other kinds of synesthesia, for colour and stuff like this. So these people have links between sound and colour and all sorts of things in ways that specific stimuli, cross-modal stimuli are linked in a very specific relationship that persists over many years in a way that we wouldn't really be able to necessarily just remember. But yeah, it's self-reported. The second question was, can we pick up racist tendencies through this kind of thing? I mean, so I think there is some evidence. So mirror touch synesthesia happens in all of us, right? We all can feel emotional states when we see other people. That's why we cry in films, this kind of stuff. And there is evidence to suggest that we tend to identify more with people that are similar to us. But many things, like people that are more attractive, people that are our own race, all sorts of things. So I think there are lots of ways we can pick up on these biases. It's kind of hard to tell whether this is actually a bias, because it could just be that you're better at recognizing it in someone that looks like you, right? It's not necessarily a kind of racial prejudice. But there are other ways we can pick up these racial prejudices. I mean, there are really simple psychological experiments where what do? Do things like make you see a word of a certain colour and you have to name the colour, not the word, and then it's much harder to do it if it's like something to do with like a racial group that you don't feel comfortable with. There's lots of ways we can pick up these sort of biases, which is disturbing.
I think I actually also have the causation factors. I was like, is it that an advanced ability to recognize and identify people with racism experience? Would that help?
Either way, right?
That's the other way I was thinking.
Okay. Yeah.
So question, you talked about using screens and experiments to have people experience actions in video and stuff like that. What impact do you think virtual reality headsets will have on perception, activation, and all this stuff? Do you see sort of role in experimentation?
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know. So I actually, the early data in macaques showed that these cells fire less well when their actions are on a screen. Other studies have shown different things. I don't know that virtual reality is going to make that much of a difference. It kind of depends on whether this is a learned neural response or not. You know, like if it's a learned neural response, then perhaps our experience in virtual reality might take a while to catch on. Whereas if it's not, maybe we'll see some sort of like huge responses. Yeah, who knows? Yeah. Any women want to ask a question? Come on, vaginas. There we go.
Aware that in anorexics, they done studies where people who have anorexia are more willing to accept a rubber hand that is placed by their hand and pokes and prodded, and they will feel the pokes and proddedness and actually like simulating their own hand much better than other normal population. I'm not sure if that's in any way connected, but have you seen any research?
Yeah, it is connected. So this is rubber hand illusion that Kat's been mentioning, and for those of you who haven't seen it, actually you can do it at home. It's not that hard to do. You basically put a rubber hand on the table, you put your hand under the table, you have somebody touch the rubber hand, and under the table, someone touches your hand also. And you have to go in the same direction, you have to kind of really be careful about how you're doing it, and some people will experience a really strong adoption of that hand into their body representation. And this is used as evidence to show that our body schema, our representation of our body in the world is really flexible and dynamic, and we can change it really quickly. And I think your point, I couldn't quite hear it, I think your point was that it's easier to adopt the rubber hand illusion if it's...
So there have been studies with populations of people who have anorexia, and they are far more willing to adopt the rubber hand.
The rubber hand, they take on the rubber hand easier.
Yes.
Yeah, so I think there's a lot of evidence that lots of different factors will change this, and I think like it's so it speaks to this idea of your sense of self, your embodied sense of self, and I've seen a lot of data showing that like various different personality factors and body dysmorphia being one of them, and then there are lots of other conditions where your sense of self can be a little bit more fluid. I think probably mirror touch synesthesia is one of those, where actually your threshold for adopting a sensation is much lower than everybody else. But I don't know, I'm not quite sure what that means. I don't think anybody knows what it means right now, but it's certainly interesting that you can kind of play around with this kind of embodied sense of self, and there are some other really strong illusions that you can induce at home. You can do it with your tongue also, which is gross.
You said a lot about like the perception and how you respond to action or to imagination. But what is the impact of memory on that? Like doing the same test with young monkeys or old monkeys, what fires and what doesn't fire the neural systems like?
Yeah.
What is the relationship between this kind of incentive stimulus and the memory, and why some of those simulations we remember and like stick with us, and other like doesn't make
Right, if I knew the answer to that, I'd be very grateful. Nobody, it's really hard to know like what predicts whether a memory is encoded or not. There's a lot of people working on that. I think it's really unclear that there's necessarily a link between what we're talking about in motor cortices and there's a link between perception and productive action and memory. So I don't know. I certainly don't know the answer to that question. Yeah. Yes.
What are you researching now?
What am I researching now? So after I left Neurons about 6 years ago, and I still work on them in a kind of way. I just don't talk about them in that way because it's problematic. But I still work on production and perception of complex voluntary motor behaviour. So I work on production of action and perception of action and how those two things are entwined. I've moved out of hands into the articulatory system, which is the most complex movement you make. Speech is the most complicated movement you make. It's amazing. This is like 80 muscles between here that are highly coordinated, and produce one of the most complex acoustical signals in the world. So it's really fun, it's complicated. So I still work on the same stuff, I just don't publish in the world of neurons anymore because it's a shit fight. And I now work in patients with brain damage, which is interesting as well. Yeah.
What are some of the biggest controversies in the mirror neuron space?
What are some of the biggest controversies in the mirror neuron space? So actually I think, they really fueled the motor theory of speech perception in a terrible way. Most theory of speech perception is the simulation theory but applied to speech. This idea that you use your motor articulating system in order to understand speech. And this theory came up decades ago, and then many people spent a long time getting rid of it. And then mirror neurons came along and stirred it up again, and it's been a real pain in the arse, And I think people I know who've been through both waves of this madness are just sort of, really frustrated. And actually what's difficult about this is that people will spend years and years and years trying to take down a theory rather than trying to figure out a good one, and it's like a sort of like 2-decade-long series of straw men. So I think that's probably been quite problematic for the field, and I think it's dying down now, so that's good. Yeah. Okay, one more, and everyone have drinks. Can I hear you?
So it sounds like your current work has a lot of applied potentials.
Say that again?
Sounds like the work that you're doing now has a lot of applied potentials. And have you think in depth about how
applied potentials for my work? I mean, I'm a blue sky scientist. Like the research I do is very unguided. I'm really interested in answering somewhat abstract questions. And there are practical applications for that. Like I work on patients, and we're trying to find out what's wrong with them, and trying to find things that make their perception better and their production better also, with some success. But that is a happy side effect for me. And I think if there are practical implications, or if practical applications were a goal, I'd probably be in industry, and a lot richer. But I think there definitely are practical applications. People trying to understand how to decode speech is a really important one. People trying to figure out how to boost mind reading is a really important one. How do we communicate without speech is a really important one. All of these kinds of things are really things that DARPA are really into. Okay, cool. Thanks for coming, guys.